Welcome to our audience online, and welcome to all of you in person here at the Bureau. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder with my partner, Dami Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is where you now find yourselves. And the Bureau is a government agency for government that does not yet exist. And this is the service that we provide, holding this space for queer books and queer culture. So thanks for coming out. We are an all volunteer organization, so we do have a suggested donation of $10, but give what you can. And if you're planning on buying books, feel free to hold on to your money and use that for books. But if you're able to give something, we appreciate it, and there's some change in the back. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists, two poets and one author, and we're going to jump right in. So Walter Holland is the author of 4 books of poetry: Reconstruction, Circuit, Transatlantic, and A Journal of the Plague Years, poems 1979 to 92, as well as the novel The March. Some of his poetry credits include Antioch Review, Art and Understanding, Arrow Street, Chiron Review, Cimarron Review, the Cream City Review, Found Object, Pegasus, and Phoebe. He lives in New York City. For more information, visit walterhollandwriter.com. Jaime Manrique is a novelist, essayist, and poet. Some of his critically acclaimed novels include Latin Moon in Manhattan, Twilight at the Equator, Cervantes Street, Our Lives Are the Rivers, and Like This Afternoon Forever. His much praised nonfiction book, Eminent Maricones Arenas, Lorca, Puig, and Me, won him a Guggenheim Fellowship. Oh, sorry, that was all one title, wasn't it? Won him a Guggenheim Fellowship. His poetry books include Scarecrow, My Night with Federico Garcia Lorca, and Tarzan, My Body, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Bram is the author of 9 novels, including the book that became the movie Gods and Monsters. He also wrote Eminent Outlaws, The Gay Writers Who Changed America. He teaches at the Gallatin School of New York University. So please welcome them all, and let's get started.
Hey, well, I guess I'm up. This book is called Reconstruction. It came out in August last year, but because of the pandemic, I couldn't do a reading for a while. Basically, I wanted to thank Donnie and Greg and the Bureau, this wonderful place, and I hope people support it, come and buy lots of books. And I also want to thank you for showing up, and thank you for tuning in. And I want to thank Jaime and Chris for being here as well. Just a little about this book. I wrote over the years a lot of poems about where I grew up, which was Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Jerry Falwell. And I was very young. I spent most of my boyhood there. So over the years, I collected a lot of these poems, and I decided to put them together. And so this is sort of like a memoir in verse, if you will, but I tend to write narrative poems primarily. The first poem is called Tobacco Shacks, and it's a prose poem, and it's for William Johnson, and I think it is self-explanatory. Tobacco shacks. I used to count them on the side of the road. Brown, abandoned walls, black tar roofing over wood, sometimes collapsing or leaning to one side. Others already tumbled, encumbered by weeds. Most of all, the shacks seemed markers of history to me, and the mystery of Virginia's past, a life I never really saw a century or more before. By my time, the early encroachment of shopping malls, housing tracts, developments had already begun. To me, the shacks seemed bleak reminders of what I read as desertion and poverty, the crumbling of a dying way of life, not continued symbols of terror or misery or blood. Farm slaves cleared these fields way back, cut down the thick woods. Meadow flowers used to be everywhere. The land worked by a system of bondage. I used to visit a friend's farm out in Amherst County, tucked away at the foot of the Piedmont Hills. He and I hiked to a slave cemetery with its old markers, limestone and dates barely visible, the rain having dissolved them, the runoff of winters, wearing away the carvings of birth years or death years. And just beyond, about a half a mile or more, one solitary brick chimney showed where the main house had stood. And I remember another day long ago, venturing with my sister, stepping through the weeds to take a closer look and see what was inside those shacks, dotting the roadsides to our lake house. We stood on the dirt floor and took in its emptiness, no trace of life anywhere, just the heat of the air from the fields and the stray sunlight of afternoon, the buzz of flies darting in and out of the shadows. And I think now of atrocities and human tragedies that still must contend with uneasy silence, and how nostalgia can act as camouflage, a sad, sweet, and wistful sheen that covers a horrific truth beneath. The second poem is called At Evening. And again, it's very much a recollection of the town and the avenue I used to live off of. It was a very elegant avenue called Rivermont Avenue. At evening. That conformity of evening when women walked and men stayed comfortably in their cars or played golf and drove home after drinks, under the lemon-colored awnings sat one frail, chattering matron in her chair, unsparing she was, a survivor of mannered restraint and studied charm under Southern light. All the town blinded in sleep, with sauntering turns of meandering speech that slowed to a drawl. Sometimes when the mountain's blue bled into red, I'd walk the avenue alone, recalling the boy who drove his car toward a wall, a lawyer's son spurned for a kiss. Obituaries, social notes, weddings, nervous fingers and pieces of cake fed to the groom's sweet mouth, living within the affront of rules. How lonely one could be, fitted to a world so heavily defined, behind the closing of blinds. Now, there was one boy in town who was from Norway, and he came into my gym class in high school, junior high, I think it was. And we went on a school trip together and stayed in Richmond, Virginia. And the poem is self-explanatory. Oslo. A body white as the snows of Norway seen in an 8th grade film. My love for the boy, born in Bergen, just arrived. Oslo's port, the ship and steamers hauling their cast nets with fish, industry, commerce, products for export, listening to the old narrator on the film as its thin strips tangled, moved apart, the looping ways of all desires, continuously streaming out of mind. Approximations in dark and light. His towering chest and wan waist. I knew him from the gym showers after he'd returned, stand by the tiles of wet white. Once stranded in a house in Richmond, a school trip. In my single bed, I passed the night, not far from him, hearing his breath and seeing the stone curve of his vaulter's arm. What is the northernmost reach of memory? Does it move with the weight of his form? Year after year in slow descent, the smooth progression of desire's storm. Could have, would have, how the captains guided their boats through the pale fjord, packets of letters to remotest towns, foghorn sea, then empty frame, sudden bleakness, unreeling to the ground. Now, as many Southern households, we had a housekeeper, of course, maid is rather pejorative to say, and this woman was very prominent in my life, and she helped me through some very hard times, I could say. This is for Emma. Your hands pressed and folded our white lives and tried to leave them perfectly uncreased, but so much was impossible to neatly separate. I knew you knew the dirt that soiled every facet of our intimate lives. Forgive me for what seemed evident and known. The last poem from the book I read is called Pixilla. Now, I had to have ballroom lessons in high school, and it was handled by two women who were well known in the town, and I had to go after junior high every day and sit and then stand and do this whole big learning foxtrot, all this stuff. And once a year, they would have the big cotillion, and we had to dress, you know, the men very formal, women very formal, and the corsage, of course. And I was more interested in the guys, actually, but the women had their choice, and then the men had their choice as to who you were going to dance with. And we all sat on opposite sides of the room. The women were lined up here, the men here, and it was just chaos when they said, go, you pick up who you're going to dance with. Anyway, cotillion. A scent of flowers, back to the 50s, the last vestige of farmland before the suburban sprawl. Cold mornings of diesel and rail, C&O flatbeds through mountain gaps, some southern debutante who wants to get married. Her gauzy dress crumples in my hands, and a mother's makeup runs from her eyes. What is it? Sex, the smell of perfume, a ballroom crowded with lanky teenagers, white gloves and tight suspenders. The boys who wear their hair long and favor portraits of town fathers, white on black, silken cummerbunds, and sheen of tuxedo jackets. Flushed faces touched by worry, hiding beers on the outside steps or lighting cigarettes one flight up while mothers spy from their chairs. receiving line of preserved smiles, that hopeful perplexity of women who seemed desirous of anything we could give, like we were deer, leaping stags that stretched and rutted in velvety coats, darting, daring. Her corsage presses to my cheek, eyeshadow blue, hardly as alluring as the boys in shiny shoes. Their slim, trim bodies, drunken, unruly postures erect, zipping their half-closed flies, jostling pinned with hothouse carnations, their tallness and haughty stares. She touches my lips, her store-bought smell, as the boys come and go before me, bright, disheveled, tough. All of them restless in starched collars, their broad necks tugging to be free, their shifting bodies hungry with need. The last two poems I will read are new. And I thought, because it's spring, I would write two poems about spring. And so the first one is called This Moment Spring. The second one, it will be the anniversary on the 21st of 35 years with my husband, Howard. So I wrote a little for him, which is sort of dovetails with the spring. So here we go, two poems. This Moment Spring. This is the spring. This is the moment of spring. This is the city and the moment of a city. This is life, life now and life that comes. This is the last hour of the hours, the last hour of all new hours to follow, and the spring I face and live to begin. This is a moment of war, too. This is the war that goes on killing in a city and a world I must accept and wander through and see, here and now and now and now. This is the moment I write and sit in spring, and the park that is so green, calm, safe, abundant. This is the moment, the beautiful moment in time in which I am not fully old, nor am I fully young. This is the start of youth and things becoming old, but still of paths and of chances. I sit and write of light and life and passing things, what's lost and found and had, and lost and read and said, of much or even nothing. And words and those I set aside. This is the spring where everything is here, as people talk again with joy, as plague and sickness now relent, and I relent of plague and sickness, its fallen things, its relentless emptiness. But now I want and need and hear, what can I do but love? Comforting to write and forget, to sit and write what's mine. Here is my spring so tangible and feeling, with all a city and a time. And this is. This is called Threshold for Howard. This threshold green whose fury lives, is worry spring alone? Or is worry something we leave in life's repeated book or door? Green is the day's constancy and grows into a closeness, as here is spring and closeness opening, here until summer's bend and end and fall. Not only the mind in time finds radiance, but I have known, and you have known, being as green as closeness, yours, mine. More than limb, stem or vein, be this our moment or none to be. Our bodies leaf, more foldings or unfolding, deeply grown, deeply in the knowing life of light and life, the days intimacies were ours, as brightness goes to dark, as darkness to eventuality. And then, bright is all and ever that must be, if we are to see eternally green, wanted, green now, and before the green in and after, shut under.
Thank you, Walter, for such a beautiful reading, very moving, and the images of it is dazzling, and the feelings that, very powerful. The construction of that world, like very beautiful. And so I'd like to thank the same people he thanked, with a couple of exceptions. and you for inviting me to read with you, because I read your book and I loved it, and so it's an honor to sit here with you and my good friend Chris for being so good to come here on this Saturday afternoon, but to this reading. Thank you, Chris. Anyway, so I haven't given a reading in English, especially of my poetry, I think in this country, and certainly not in New York, in almost 12 years. I haven't read my poems. And when I do give readings, mostly they're in Colombia now, so I'm used to reading in Spanish, my first language. And so the other day I decided, what am I going to read? And I found some poems and said, let me try to see what, and I've forgotten how to do that. I don't know how to read a poem, but so I hope I somehow, I don't know what. So I think that and the order, I'm going to read from in this country I've published 2 books, 2 full-length books in English translation, and one plaquette, one what are they called? The chapbook. But in Spanish I've published several, 4 or 5 books of poetry. So I'm going to read from the books that have come out here, and a couple of new poems, that very recent ones written in the last, some of them, one I wrote last week. So just to give a sense of how, I don't know, give a sense of what, but just to give a sense of, what I've been doing all these years.
I've been doing far more than that.
Well, the first, I read from the first one last, and this is from my second book, which was published by Painted Leaf Press, that my friend, the late Bill Sullivan, started, and he started it to publish poetry, and I think this was probably the last book of poetry he published, and so and then that was and then after that the press went under, and he died. So this is but he wanted to do this book, so I put it together for him, and it's I'll talk a little bit about these books, these poems. I wrote them in around it was 1996, I think. I in Mount Holyoke College invited me to go there to write in residence in the Spanish department for a year. And so in the second half of that year, I moved to Amherst, and a little cabin in the woods that had been built by a local poet who built it with his own hands. And it was this big, it was one-tenth of this room, the whole cabin. And then, it was a period of great introspection. And I began to write poems more and more about, parts of my life that I had never written about. It was like, in that sense, it was kind of terrifying, all that solitude. It was really beautiful. But so, and one day I remember this man from my childhood. I grew up in Barranquilla, a horrible town in Colombia. Never go there. I really, I know there is somebody from Barranquilla here because they'll kill me. No, but I'm just kidding. It's really beautiful. It's beautiful. It's really the most beautiful place on earth. Well, so this is, he was the only known homosexual in town. And it was a town of like maybe 500,000 people or 400,000 people at that time. And we all called him Tarzan, like Tarzan of the Apes, okay? And but he was like an important, like everybody knew him, and he was quite a legend. And so Tarzan. When I was 13, there was in my hometown a man we called Tarzan because of his build, an outcast in Barranquilla, infamous for preying on youth. Tarzan's t-shirts bandaged his torso. He swaggered down the street like a Pied Piper who could drag behind him boys like me and ruin us. Late in the afternoons, when the amapolas gashed dusk in their scarlet and the honeysuckle infused the hour with a sweet languor, Tarzan appeared on my street, announced by the catcalls of the neighbors, who hiding behind their blinds called him names, which he shook off like a macaw after grinning, shakes off his down. Every afternoon I read in my rocking chair, waiting for that moment when he'd appear. My heart beating so fast, I placed an open palm on my mouth as he strutted a defiant animal, singing the song of perdition. Not once did he ever look in my direction, though he must have known I was there because I felt the heat of his ways, a tongue of fire singeing me. Tarzan's cat eyes bored into my soul, a bird with a burning beak, spearing the heart of a flower. I was afraid Tarzan would expose me for what I was, someone like him, someone who craved the touch of men. 30 years have passed since that time. I am riding in a cabin in the woods on top of a white hill. It's been snowing all day, and I look out of my window through gleaming icicles. But Tarzan does not appear now on my ghostly street. The longing I felt then grips me, reminding me of the pool of the flesh, bringing back memories that still brand me after all these years. So now I'm going to read a couple of poems. I don't know. First, I read this kind of longish poem because somebody told me the other day that you should read that poem. It's one of the few good poems you have. It's a little long, but anyway. So it's like after this, it will be really short. The rest of the read. That is, by the way, this book was translated by Edith Grossman. I don't know if you know who she is, and the translator of Don Quixote. She doesn't translate anymore for health reasons, and she stopped translating a few years ago. And my friend Eugene Ritchie. But this is one of her translations, and it's called Memories. I remember that when I awoke, branches heavy with lilac came in the window. I remember the Persian aroma of the oleaceae, and how, when I moved the lilacs aside, the valley, the sky, the wildflowers, the bees, and the sun all glistened. The river sparkled like a watery avenue of silver, and boats with sails like bridal veils cut through it. I remember the distant reefs, green and craggy as a giant iguana's tail. I remember the excited cooing of the doves and their demented pirouettes in the air. I remember the tame, good-natured landscape and the breeze through the apple trees, as sweet as a passionate tongue. I remember how my flesh shouted, today, right now, you're loved and you love. I remember how at twilight, At the very tip of Manhattan, the Hudson flows between Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. I remember that turning their back on a hyperbolic sunset, the last towers of Wall Street, as mysterious and mystical as millenarium towers, brilliant with golden power, are enormous cotillions, burning with gold and silver, indigo and emerald. I remember that this island, where I've tasted all the pleasures, is not my home. I remember having watched from the 40th floor while a gold glided among skyscraper, and a helicopter like a metal bee landed on a roof as if it were a Corolla. I remember that one sleepless night, stretched out on a sofa, I looked through the window at magnolias in bloom and a moon the color of winding sheets. I remember the phantoms that slipped away dancing on tiptoe in a circle at the edge of the woods around a white fire. And I remember a garden of ripe squash as if it were a battered field of fallen moons. I remember getting up from the sofa, opening the door and walking down the path. I remember that the night birds trilling an invitation to sing to the moon. Don't you dare, you fool, said the enraged voice of Celine. I remember that I answered in surprise, moon, don't be ungrateful. I've sung to you on all my sleepless nights. I remember the long list of insults the moon flung at Sappho and Lorca, Cavafy, Shelley and Keats, Sylvia Plath and Leopardi. I remember endless things and images. At siesta, my mother cut her lover's toenails. In that position, my mother looked like Mary Magdalene. Other times, I remember Julius Caesar, the Roman. I remember that the month of July, when everything is green and the universe sings, is named for him. I remember how the Romans called him every woman's man and every man's woman. I remember he was an aristocrat, a playboy, a soldier. I remember he crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey and said, everybody knows what he said. I remember he was dictator for life and his pals assassinated him, that he fought 50 battles and massacred millions, that he believed in astrological projections, but refused to heed the prophecy of his death. I remember that Brutus stabbed him in the groin, that when he died, he said, what difference does it make what he said? I remember all this and more besides. I remember thousands of gestures, hundreds of men, their hearts beating against mine. What I remember is not a necklace, a pendant with a perfect clasp, a bracelet that adorns the hand that moves mountains, a chain around a neck that has been loved but not enough. I remember my loves and my hates. I don't remember the moment I was born and how I thought of my first poem. And I don't want to remember how my face and I alone face the mirror. I remember that death is not remembering. I remember, ergo, I live. So these are most more recent poems, and they're completely different from my other poems. The poem is mostly about other places that not Colombia or the United States, but a little bit, but they're about like travel in a way, but also like political also. So the first one is called The Stranger. And The Stranger is after Camus' novel, The Stranger. And about, 15 years ago, I went to Algeria, and Camus was from Algeria, and he was born in the town of Oran. I didn't go there because of Camus, but I went to, Cervantes had been there in the 16th century, in the 15th century, and he had been a slave for like 5 years. So I was, like doing research about that. And so that's why I went there, and then I went to Oran because Cervantes also visited Oran in his lifetime. So The Stranger, and it's really not about the stranger, but about the play, the long novel by Camus, where everybody's dying in the town, and The Stranger. Dusk descends on the plaza, coated with desert dust. We sit under the solitary tree and drink coffee out of miniature cups half filled with sugar. The hour is swollen with jasmine. Bands of swallows swirl above us like airborne carpets in the darkening sky. The ruined buildings around the plaza are not Roman, but colonial French, the language spoken by the men in twos and threes around us, sitting at metal tables and iron chairs. This is the time of the day when Dr. Rieu, in Camus' The Play, would open the door to his empty apartment. Far away, his wife is convalescing. Rieu heads straight for the bathroom and soaks his hands that all day long have handled dying Oranians. But the doctor cannot wash away the stench of death all over himself. I haven't come to Oran looking for Camus, who is hated here. He was on the wrong side of history, or was he? I'm about to remark on this to my companion when faintly at first I hear a voice, not meant for us, but instead for heaven, a flute-like prayer rising from the speaker attached to the golden tip of a mosque. It is the appearance of the pole star. In the wine blue sky, the voice sings, "In 4 days, my mother will be dead." It's strange. And this is another poem that this one is about Kashmir, which is a little country in the north of India, on the border with China. I've never been to Kashmir, so it's about, you know, like an imaginary thing, but it's like, it has some basis in reality. Kashmir. Muhannad, now I'll take a nap, as I often do in the afternoons of my old age, and dream of jade trees in your village, the tropical decay, the cloudy rivers, where the tiger laps the reflections of the mosques, resplendent like suns made of gold. In my reveries, Muhannad, I'll run my fingers through the night forest of your hair, and I'll lie on top of you, lips to open lips, breath to breath. And then I don't know, there is one more poem about immigration and the other one about Reinaldo Arenas, which I wrote about 2 weeks ago for a thing on, that was done on Times Square, Father Duffy's Square, and a Cuban-American artist, conceptual artist, built this room, you know, it's like made out of leaves or something, and then right there in the middle of the square, and the inside of the space, the room is the inside is also in purple colors electronically, and there was a poem going around the ceiling. It was really wonderful, and it was not needed to protest all the writers in prison nowadays, and especially in Cuba. And 6 artists who are in Cuba now, and you know, they've been in jail for a long time. And especially he wanted to remember Reinaldo Arenas, the Cuban writer, because he had admired Reinaldo very much, and Reinaldo was also one of those persecuted writers, and so you can imagine how that was, the chaos of Times Square at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, like hundreds of thousands of people going by, running, screaming, preaching, dancing, you know, singing, you know, buses, cars, you know, everything that you can imagine. The noise was deafening, and I thought, how are we going to do this? I have no idea. So, like, we, you know, the people from PEN America, they gave a little speech about the writers in prison, and then 2 other poems, read a couple of poems, and then I wrote an elegy about Reinaldo, because that's what I said, well, I'll read, you know, I don't know what I'll read, but he said, why didn't you write a poem about him? I said, okay, I will. And so I decided to write an elegy. I've never written only one other elegy in my life. But something really beautiful happened at the end of the reading, you know, I hadn't noticed. Well, in the middle of the reading, a woman came running at me, and she looked like mad, and her hair was like this, and she was screaming, "Revolution, Fidel Castro!" I don't know. I thought, oh my God, this is like not being killed. But somebody, you know, like away, and she calmed down. And then so, like, I continued reading, and then at the end of the reading, I had suggested that they play the song Guantanamera, you know, to remember Reinaldo. And I hadn't noticed that, like, I don't know, a bunch of people, Cubans, so they have flags and signs, were in the back, you know, they were not in the other people were sat with invitations or whatever, and they all began to sing Guantanamera at once, very loudly and beautifully. And at that moment, Times Square went silent. All you could hear was all these people singing that. It was really quite one of the most remarkable nights of my life. And so after that description, my poem is really going to come as a disappointment. But Elegy for Reynaldo Arenas. He was my good friend, and he lived on 43rd Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. And I lived on 8th Street and on 43rd and between 43rd and 44th. So I knew him for all the years he was in New York. And we were neighbors, we would see each other often. And, and he published my poems, like whatever, and in all the endless newspapers he would publish all the time, and magazines. And maybe some of you have seen the movie Before Night Falls, but many people have seen the movie and they don't know who Reynaldo Arenas is. They think it's, it's a movie or whatever. So when they find out that that's his life, they're surprised. Okay, Elegy for Reynaldo Arenas. And this is my attempt at political poetry. More than 30 years have passed since you ended your own life, denying AIDS the last word. You died on a winter night 2 blocks west of Father Duffy's Square, where we celebrate you tonight. From the window of the living room on the 6th floor of your walk-up tenement apartment, you saw the Hudson hurtle south until its icy waters meet the Atlantic, and hundreds of miles down the eastern coast transformed the chilly ocean into a pageant of tropical extravagance. The sea of 7 colors, the crater's Cuba in its diaphanous waves, the island you sang to, an emerald land, the color of humanity's hope. In book after book, poem after heartbroken poem, like a raging prophet of ancient times, you howled against the oppression of your people in heart-rending areas that touch our jaded hearts. You wrote that New York and Cuba were similar, except that here you could howl to the heavens, because here in Times Square, all the persecuted and tortured and all the undocumented and all the queer people of every nation can be free to love. In the final act of your life, you dictated an ode to freedom, the story of all that you were in your many contradictions. An artist who never bowed to tyranny and never stopped questing for freedom. More than 30 years have passed since you left, but you continue to inspire us with your prodigious words and your indomitable spirit. So this April evening in the year 2022, we welcome the arrival of spring and celebrate your example at a time when sometimes feels like humanity is too alive. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I thought actually, there's some similarities a little bit between Jaime's work and mine, just in terms of poems that evoke the past that we both shared, but we were also young men that left our counties or countries to come to New York and live a life as queer guys. So I asked Chris to join us, which I'm so happy about, to lead a little bit of a conversation with anything he wants to ask about our writing.
Anything. Well, yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. You introduced one of the questions I wanted to explore, because that was one of the similarities. You're both exiles from other places, but you've made in touch with those other places. I want to ask both of you, how does that feed your poetry? I mean, it clearly does. And then, and maybe just jump right into that. And I have some other questions too. But well, now you're still in touch with. You go back to Lynchburg?
I still go back to Lynchburg. I have family there. It's changed my relationship with the town, of course, after many years. And because the times we're in have changed a great deal. And the issue of race, I grew up in the desegregated years of the South. And there was a race riot, they called it, in my high school. There was a student shot who died, and there was a big trial in town. And there was a Confederate soldier monument statue at the top of the steps. So given the worldly change that we've gone through in America and just all of the cultural tensions, I wrote a lot of these poems like really a long time ago, and they were sort of very sentimental. They still have a certain amount of nostalgia. So I had to revisit them, and I realized there was a lot I didn't see. There was a lot I just didn't understand. And so the book, I actually had to write a preface, and most people don't write prefaces to poetry books, but I wanted to explain that discrepancy, the time warp. And I also wanted to, I gave an excerpt at the front of the book of what we were taught. It's in the textbook about slavery. And it was all about General Lee and riding his beautiful horse Traveler. And so I actually went back and I rewrote and added some words.
But it's, well, okay, I'm a novelist who loves to read poetry, but I tend to read poetry for stories. So actually, both of you, I was getting all these different stories, which was great. But in your book, I love the kind. It becomes like a family photo album, and these different pieces of stories. Both what we know now is juxtaposed with how you saw it then. I mean, it's kind of amazing just how you're looking back on the past, and a poem that is relatively innocent will then be followed by something that is very painful. And then some of the, I love your poem, The Balcony,
Yes.
about a segregated movie theater, and hearing the Black audience upstairs, how they're responding to the same movie the narrator is seeing. And it's this great kind of binocular double vision. It's really effective. It really captures. Okay, I'm from Virginia too, and we're like, I'm like a couple of years older than you, or we're the same generation.
We're the same generation.
And I was at the other end of the state. I was in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. So it's kind of, there's all these little echoes, things I recognize. Something as small as the C&O flat cars. Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. They began in Lynchburg, and then they would end up in Norfolk.
Right.
So, oh my God, who else knows about the C&O Railroad? So those little flashes of recognition like that, but also this whole world of segregated swimming pools, a segregated movie theater, just those cotillions. That's such a magical word. It's very evocative of this other era, and so it's very evocative. But it's like the book works as a whole. There's a one voice and one point of view holding it together, but it's very complex. It is like a family photo album, and a story emerges, and we get to see the social change. And we get to see a lot about your family. The glimpses of your family are really strong. When you went back and took these old poems, were you kind of assembling them and adding to them? What was that like to do?
I was assembling them, adding to them. I tend to write narratives, of course, you can see, and I'm very drawn to photographs. Photography and movies were what I grew up on visually. So I noticed Jaime's poems, many of them draw from art, painting, and very visually vivid colors. And yes, I went back and I revisited some poems and I rewrote them. The Balcony poem, I used to go watch Disney cartoons, and the balcony upstairs I wasn't aware of. And it had a side entrance which said blacks only. And I would sit down and I'd be laughing, watching, Bambi or something. And then I would hear just a little laughter upstairs, but I wasn't aware. It's amazing to me. It was only till I went outside after the show that I would see all of these kids going down the side staircase and disappearing up the hill. And so there again, cinematically, I saw the movie, and I tried to do that in the poem to simultaneously put together these real pretty cartoonish things that I was watching in bright colors, and then the despair.
Yeah. It's very effective. It's a terrific point. It's haunting.
Partly that's why I asked Chris, because I knew of your Virginia roots. And so I thought he would have a certain sensibility to that. But I also wanted to say, I think I'm curious. I grew up in essentially a colonial country or state. It was a colony. And I don't know what your experience was of Colombia growing up. If you had was there a colonial sense there?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, very much. I think that the culture was like I think that the poor people and people who didn't didn't have any privileges or education, the culture was totally Mexican. The Mexican movies, the Mexican picture books, and that's what they knew, and they were very popular, and the music and then the other people who went to schools and all that kind of stuff, they were very Americanized, or in Bogota they were very English. Bogota was had a lot of English traditions from the, I guess, the 30s, the 20s, or whatever. And so, and I grew up between Bogota and Barranquilla, which are very completely different places. Bogota is high up in the mountains, and Barranquilla is a tropical town by the sea, So, but the Colombian writer Garcia Marquez, he came once when he was a young man to the deep south, looking for Faulkner, like to see the places that Faulkner had written about. And went through Virginia and all these places. And then he wrote, I just remember this as we were talking, that he said that the South was just exactly like the place we come from in Colombia, from Barranquilla, because it was a savage place, but it produced brilliant writers. I don't know, that was the observation he made.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about being a savage place, but yeah, so the culture was, like as I said, the other part of the culture that was also very Catholic. So like I went to a Jewish school. I also went to a Protestant school. But the Archbishop of Barranquilla, like very often he would give these proclaims saying that the kids who went to the American school were all going to hell. So if you opened the Bible, you were going to hell, stuff like that. It was that was the kind of culture I came from, and of course profoundly homophobic. Like even though there were all these, like in my family, there were like two of my uncles who never married. One who slept all day long, and he only went out at night and returned like at 6 a.m. So we used to call him Dracula. And he never married. So, and then the other uncle younger was also the same thing. So I think both of them were like, gay men who could not find a way to express themselves in that culture, and they led one died, of alcoholism, and with a wet brain in the slum in Barranquilla. The one died living in the countryside, also living on a piece of land that my grandfather had, away from everybody. So those were very tragic examples of that was like the thing that if I had to mention about what marked me the most about Barranquilla or Bogota, Bogota was little. I was there from 7 to 11. So, but still, I love that. But Barranquilla was like the homophobia in the schools, the bullying, and and then that poem that I read, Tarzan, that he was the only known homosexual in the city. That the city was full of closeted homosexuals, and they were all married, and whatever. So, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, no. I just wanted to say I had talking about queer and gay. When I was very young, I was raised Catholic, and Catholic was a minority actually in my town because it was all Baptist, Southern Baptist, or Episcopal. And anyway, there was one person that a young man who I knew was gay, or had been told. I heard all this whisper about him. And he used to come with his mother every Sunday to Catholic church. And they would come on purpose early, not early, late. And they would slip out early so that there could be no interaction. And everyone stared at him. I used to stare at him, trying to figure out what does gay mean? What is this guy? What makes him different? And he wouldn't go and take communion because you couldn't at that time. It was a sin. So that was my first boyhood kind of introduction because of the shame of it and the strange thing that he was called a mama's boy because he would always come with his mother, but impeccably dressed, suit and tie. Now, I came to New York and then I left New York to go home in like 81 or 82 to study for school. I couldn't study here because I went to PT school here in New York, but I couldn't do the prerequisites. The only reason I say this is I went back to Lynchburg and I settled. All of these gay men had started gentrifying this old antebellum neighborhood on a hillside. And I went to live there with a gay fellow, and it was full of the only gays and lesbians practically in town. And we ran a kind of a AIDS hotline. But the thing was, the only reason I say this is I suddenly realized that the whole town had this gay history that was silently happening while I was growing up. And I met a judge who was living a life with a doctor, both married, both had kids, and they would meet in a house downtown. Their wives didn't know, but I knew, and everyone knew, but those were the codes that we had to live with. But all I'm saying is I came back to Lynchburg and Virginia, and I discovered what I should have known all along is that queer life is everywhere, it's everywhere, and times change.
I mean, have you been back to Barranquilla?
Oh yeah, I go back to Colombia often, and so I didn't go for 20 years. It was a period when from 1980 until 2000, I didn't go to Colombia because I didn't want to know anything about Colombia, and I said I'm never going back. And then, like somebody published, Evelyn Maricón is there, so I had the publisher say, no, this changes. Nobody's going to kill you for publishing that. You can come. And so I went, and since then I've been going there, often. And not during this pandemic, I had an invitation to go 2 weeks ago, and I couldn't go because I don't know, I didn't travel by myself. And so, you know, it's very conflict. You know, it's very, for me, it's a conflict to be in Colombia. I love the place. When I go there, I'm always very, full of this very, intense feelings, for the things I see and the people I see and everything. But, I cannot, the things that I hate about it haven't changed very much. It's still a very classist society. The poor are really oppressed horribly. The government is very, authoritarian. Most, especially the one now came. And when I was there in 1980, when I returned in the first time that I was there after college, it was in 1975. I went with my friend Bill. We were the only gay couple who were open in the city of Bogota, who were living openly as gay people. And that was a city at that point of like 3 million people, And I had many friends who were homosexual and they had partners, but it could not be mentioned. They could never, it was all, they're very good friends, but not even with other friends, gay friends, because no, So that kind of stuff, I thought, no, I cannot live like that. Maybe so if it changes someday. It has changed some, of course, and but the oppression of the people, the last time I was there, I remember I was having lunch, just a diner or something, and I looked out the front door, and there was by the front door a little boy like this, like this little boy, maybe it was 5 or 6, all in ragged clothing and really dirty. And I don't remember if he was wearing shoes, and this was in Bogota, where it's cold. And what he was doing was waiting for from the waiters to come from the back of the kitchen to throw out the garbage, the things, and then he would. I saw a little boy opening the can and then pulling out like a potato or a piece of carrot or a little piece of meat and putting it in a plastic bag. And he did that until he filled the bag and then he left. It was food for his family or something. And I thought, I cannot live in a world where I see that just as an everyday thing. It's because it's so it's tough. It's tough to go back. But I admire many things about Colombia, and the Colombian culture is very rich and it's really very. I think nowadays it has all kinds of important artists all over the world, and not all over the world.
One of the preparation for this, I've kind of spent the last 2 months reading their poems, which is a real, just kind of exploring slowly, and I've only read a couple of your poems. I knew Jaime only as a novelist, and I love his novels, but it was a real pleasure reading his poems. So it was kind of just 2 very different writers, and the similarities are interesting, and the differences. I mean, in a way, Jaime, you're doing kind of snapshot poems too, but they're like X-rays. They're more, as you were saying, they're more like paintings. They're more colorful, but you have many different voices depending on your subject. So there could be also very plain, direct, as plain and direct as Walter's poems, where there's Al from Alabama about a gay man in Greenwich Village, and others like that. Just very, and then followed by the one about the boy eating fruit and eating the seeds, and imagining he will. Swallow a seed, it'll grow into a tree, and it'll become a tree full of birds, and then he won't have to go to school. Which I thought was an inspiring time. Right? And Flo, can I do that? I'm curious. Okay, you're bilingual. So what's it like when somebody else translates your poetry from Spanish into English? You've got Edith Grossman who's translated. She's one of the great translators.
yeah, I never said anything to her about her translation. She said, "Oh, tell me whatever you think," because she's a great translator. I thought, who am I to try to correct her?
Right.
So I was very happy with the translation. So I consider myself very lucky that way. And the fiction I've mostly written in Spanish in the last 30 years, in English for the last 30 years, because since I decided at that point that I wasn't going to go back to Colombia, I thought I might as well learn how to write in English. And I'm going to write in English no matter what. And I've been doing it sort of badly or whatever, but since then I've been writing in English pretty much my fiction. And the poetry, like most people don't really know that I'm a poet. Recently in Bogota, they did this homage to me at the book fair in Bogota. And my editor there was like one of the people who spoke. And then 2 people spoke before him and they talked about most about my poetry. Then my editor who's published like 5 of my novels said, "Jaime, I had no idea you were a poet." He said, "Well, you're not the only one." So but it's like, I think it's my first love in many ways and continues to be, I read more poetry than I read fiction and I'm always reading poetry all the time. So.
And Walter, you also write fiction. So a novel, The March.
The March, yeah.
So what was it like going from poetry to fiction?
It was relatively painless. I thought it was going to be worse. But the book seemed to flow out of itself, and it wrote itself. All I can say. But I prefer poetry.
Oh. Well, I think your poetry is very plain spoken and direct, and you're both very good storytellers. I mean, so that's so that even a young novelist like myself can really enjoy that. So
Good. Well, I guess that's.
or any questions from
Any questions?
Insults.
I had a question, Chris. So, both Walter and Jaime had their stories about gays in their towns. And what's the first one that comes to mind for you?
well, I grew up in Norfolk in Virginia Beach, and I didn't really know any gay people until I went away to college, which is also in Virginia, at William and Mary. And I kind of knew I was gay, but was very shy and quiet about it. So it was, and it was the early 70s. It was just after Stonewall. And suddenly, not many people, but a few were kind of out and proud. There was William and Mary had a gay student organization that lasted like 6 months because they couldn't get enough people. Because people,
Right.
and but it was there. It was present, and it was just kind of quietly arose. For me, the big gay moment was when Leonard Matlovich came to speak at the school. It was right after I graduated, like 76, I think. And suddenly you looked around and the room was packed. All these people you'd seen around, both students and faculty. And I realized there's a lot of us. And I didn't know. I never, and maybe a few were there out of curiosity. I'm sure afterwards I realized we're all gay here. And men and women. It was just crowded. But it was kind of, it was Virginia. Everybody is very polite, which you catch in your poems. It's very repressed. But suddenly Leonard Matlovich, the out member of the military, comes to speak, and we're all there. So it was beautiful. It was
Yeah, that's nice one.
but it took somebody from the outside to do that.
A man in a uniform.
A man in a uniform. No longer he was out of the uniform by then. But it was, yeah. So.
Any other anything else?
Howard, will you have your hand up? Or?
No, exercising my.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I have a strange request. Could you read one of your poems in Spanish?
Me? Oh, yeah,
Oh,
sure.
that-
Something that's not very. This one is like okay. El cielo encima de la casa de mi madre. Es una noche de julio perfumada de gardenias. La luna y las estrellas brillan sin revelar la esencia de la noche. A través del anochecer, con sus gradaciones cada vez más intensas de ónix, el resplandor dorado de los astros, las sombras, mi madre ha ido ordenando su casa, el jardín, la cocina. Ahora, mientras ella duerme, yo camino en su jardín, inmerso en la soledad de esta hora. Se me escapan los nombres de muchos árboles y flores, y había más pinos antes donde los naranjos florecen ahora. Esta noche pienso en todos los cielos que he contemplado y que alguna vez amé. Esta noche las sombras alrededor de la casa son benignas. El cielo es una cámara oscura que proyecta imágenes borrosas. En la casa de mi madre, los destellos de los astros me perforan con nostalgia, y cada hilo de la red que circunvala este universo es una herida que nos sana. This one surfaces a lot every year for a Mother's Day. And you know, it's like, so it's my hit, like my number one person.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg.
Thank you all. So we have books by all three of our visitors, and please hang out. We'll take care of the chairs. Don't worry about that. And thank you to our visitors on